The morning fog hung thick over the hills of western Virginia, clinging to the ancient oaks and chestnuts that formed the dense canopy of the Appalachian wilderness. Aileen Morrison stood at the edge of her family's property line, where the cultivated tobacco fields gave way to the wild forest that stretched endlessly toward the Blue Ridge Mountains. The year was 1897, and at 23, she was already considered past the ideal marrying age by the standards of their small mountain community of Cedar Hollow. Her auburn hair, loosely pinned beneath a simple bonnet, caught the early October sunlight as she gazed into the shadowy depths of the trees. The forest had always called to her, offering a promise of something beyond the suffocating expectations that pressed upon her daily like the heavy wool of her dress. Her father, Thomas Morrison, had arranged her engagement to Fergus MacLeod, the son of the wealthiest landowner in the county. Fergus was 31, a widower with 2 young children, and though he was known as a decent man who rarely drank and never raised his hand in anger, Aileen felt nothing but a cold dread when she thought of spending her remaining years in his stone house, raising another woman's children while bearing her own in endless succession. The wedding was set for the end of the month, and with each passing day, she felt the walls of her future closing in around her like the narrow mountain passes that hemmed in their valley. That morning, she had risen before dawn, unable to sleep as thoughts of her impending marriage churned through her mind. Her mother, Sarah, had already begun gathering her hope chest items, embroidering linens with the intertwined initials that would mark her new identity as Mrs. MacLeod. Her younger sister, Margaret, only 16, looked at her with a mixture of envy and pity, understanding perhaps better than anyone the conflict that raged within Aileen's heart. The house had been filled with wedding preparations for weeks, the parlor transformed into a sewing room where the women of Cedar Hollow gathered daily to work on her wedding dress, a creation of ivory silk that her mother had ordered from Richmond at considerable expense. As she stood at the forest's edge, Aileen remembered the stories the old mountain people told about these woods. They spoke of hunters who had vanished without a trace, of Cherokee paths that led nowhere, of valleys so deep and dark that the sun never reached their floors. But these were just tales meant to keep children from wandering too far from home, she told herself. The real dangers were bears and wildcats, treacherous ravines hidden by undergrowth, and the disorientation that could overcome even experienced woodsmen in the endless repetition of ridge and hollow. Yet even these tangible threats seemed less frightening than the life that awaited her in Fergus MacLeod's bed and kitchen. She had learned to read and write at the small schoolhouse in Cedar Hollow, where the teacher, Miss Catherine Pruitt from Philadelphia, had filled her head with stories of women in the cities who worked in offices, who attended lectures, who chose their own paths. Miss Pruitt had left after only 2 years, driven away by the disapproval of the local church elders who believed she was putting dangerous ideas into the minds of their daughters. But the seeds had been planted in Aileen's imagination, and they had grown into a fierce longing for something more than what Cedar Hollow could offer. The morning air was crisp with the promise of frost, and Aileen pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she took her first steps into the forest. She had walked these paths many times before, but never alone, and never with the intention of going so far. Usually she gathered chestnuts with Margaret or searched for ginseng roots with her grandmother, always staying within sight of the smoke from their chimney. But today something drew her deeper into the woods, past the familiar landmarks of the lightning-struck oak and the creek where they collected watercress in spring. The forest floor was soft with decades of fallen leaves, muffling her footsteps as she walked. Overhead, squirrels chattered their alarm at her presence, and she could hear the distant drumming of a woodpecker echoing through the trees. The path she followed was an old one, perhaps used by the Cherokee before they were forced from these mountains 60 years ago, or by the earliest white settlers searching for game. It wound along the ridge, offering occasional glimpses through the trees of the valley below, where she could see the thin streams of smoke rising from the chimneys of Cedar Hollow. As she walked, Aileen thought about the conversation she had overheard the previous evening between her parents. Her father had been discussing the terms of her marriage settlement with her mother, talking about her as if she were a heifer being sold at market. Her dowry would include 20 acres of good bottom land, 2 milk cows, and a chest of her grandmother's silver. In exchange, Fergus would provide a home and security, taking on the responsibility of a wife who, her father had said with a note of frustration, had always been too headstrong for her own good. Her mother had murmured agreement, adding that marriage and motherhood would settle her wild notions, as they had for every woman before her. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist and revealing the full glory of the autumn forest. The maples blazed red and orange, the hickories glowed yellow, and the oaks showed every shade from green to brown. It was beautiful enough to make her heart ache. This freedom, this solitude, this moment of being answerable to no one but herself. She knew she should turn back, that her absence would soon be noticed, that there would be questions and anger and disappointment. But her feet carried her forward, deeper into the wilderness, as if they had a will of their own. By midday, she had traveled further than she ever had before, reaching a part of the forest where the trees grew so thick that little sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. Here the air was cooler, damper, filled with the smell of decomposing leaves and rich earth. She found herself following a creek that tumbled over moss-covered rocks, its water clear and cold when she knelt to drink from it. Her stomach reminded her that she had brought no food, having left the house with only the vague intention of a morning walk. But the hunger seemed unimportant compared to the intoxicating sense of freedom that filled her lungs with each breath. As the afternoon wore on, Aileen began to realize that she had lost the path. The creek had divided several times, and she had chosen her direction at random, always moving away from home, away from Cedar Hollow, away from the future that had been chosen for her. The forest had become a maze of identical ridges and hollows, each looking much like the last, with no landmark to guide her back even if she had wanted to return. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western ridges when Fergus MacLeod arrived at the Morrison farm, expecting to take supper with his intended bride and her family, as had become his custom each Sunday. He found the household in barely controlled chaos, with Sarah Morrison pacing the porch, wringing her hands, and Thomas Morrison organizing the men of the community into search parties. Aileen had been missing since dawn, and as the shadows lengthened across the valley, the initial irritation at her thoughtlessness had transformed into genuine fear. Fergus felt a complex mixture of emotions as he absorbed the news. Part of him was angry that Aileen had caused such trouble and embarrassment, particularly so close to their wedding day. Another part, one he didn't care to examine too closely, felt a strange relief, as if her disappearance had lifted a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. He had agreed to the marriage out of practical necessity, needing a mother for his children and a woman to manage his household. Aileen was beautiful, educated, and from a good family, even if she did have what his mother called peculiar notions. He had assumed that time and the responsibilities of marriage would cure her of those notions, as they had cured his first wife Mary, of her initial reluctance to leave her family's farm in Pennsylvania. The search parties fanned out across the familiar paths around Cedar Hollow, calling Aileen's name until their voices grew hoarse. They searched the old Cherokee caves where the local boys went to smoke tobacco stolen from their fathers' barns. They checked the swimming hole where the young people gathered on hot summer days, though the water was far too cold now for swimming. They walked the paths to neighboring farms, thinking perhaps she had gone to visit a friend and lost track of time. But as darkness fell and the searchers returned empty-handed, the awful possibility that she had entered the deep forest began to take hold. Margaret, Aileen's younger sister, sat in the kitchen, her face pale and drawn. She knew more than she had told the others about her sister's state of mind. Just 3 nights ago, Aileen had come to her room after everyone was asleep, sitting on the edge of her bed in her nightgown. She had talked about feeling like a wild bird being forced into a cage, about the dreams she had where she was walking through endless forests, free and alone. Margaret had assumed it was just pre-wedding nerves, the kind of fears all women faced before marriage. Now she wondered if she should have seen it as a warning, if she could have somehow prevented this. Old Samuel Cray, who had hunted these mountains for 60 years, shook his head gravely when Thomas Morrison asked about the chances of finding someone who had ventured into the deep forest unprepared. The wilderness was vast, he explained, stretching for hundreds of miles in every direction, full of ravines that could swallow a person whole, cliffs hidden by rhododendron thickets, and streams that became raging torrents after a sudden mountain storm. Even experienced woodsmen had been known to become disoriented in the endless repetition of ridge and hollow, walking in circles until exhaustion overtook them. And then there were the bears, growing fat on chestnuts and acorns before winter, and the mountain lions that still prowled the remotest valleys, though they were seen less frequently than in his youth. As the first search day turned into the second, and then the third, the entire community of Cedar Hollow became involved in the effort. Women prepared food for the searchers, children were kept home from school to help with chores, and even the Sunday church service was devoted to prayers for Aileen's safe return. Reverend Wallace spoke from the pulpit about the dangers of pride and independence, particularly in women, though Sarah Morrison's sharp intake of breath made him quickly shift to prayers for God's mercy and protection. Fergus found himself leading one of the search parties, more out of obligation than genuine desire. As they pushed deeper into the forest, following game trails and creek beds, he began to understand something about Aileen that he had never grasped before. This wilderness, with its danger and beauty, its freedom and isolation, was what she had been looking at every time he had seen her gaze drift away during their conversations about household management and child-rearing. He had assumed she was simply absent-minded or perhaps slow-witted, despite her education. Now he realized she'd been dreaming of escape. On the 4th day of searching, one of the parties found something. It was Aileen's shawl, caught on a thorn bush near a creek about 7 miles from Cedar Hollow, further into the forest than anyone had expected her to travel. The fabric was torn, but not weathered, suggesting she had passed this way recently. The discovery both encouraged and alarmed the searchers. She had survived at least the first day, but she had also traveled in the opposite direction from home, deeper into the wilderness, rather than trying to return. Thomas Morrison aged visibly during those days of searching. The strong, commanding man who had arranged his daughter's future with such certainty now seemed bent and fragile, his voice breaking when he called her name through the trees. He had always been hardest on Aileen, demanding that she conform to his expectations of proper feminine behavior, punishing her childhood attempts at independence with harsh words and occasionally with his belt. Now he would have given anything to have her back, wild notions and all. Sarah Morrison retreated into herself, moving through the days like a ghost, cooking meals that no one had the appetite to eat, keeping the house ready for a daughter who might never return. She had been born Aileen's age when she married Thomas, and she had never questioned the path her life had taken. But now, looking at her daughter's empty chair at the dinner table, she wondered if she had failed Aileen by not understanding the depth of her unhappiness, by not providing her with something to make the prospect of marriage more bearable. The search expanded to neighboring counties, with word sent to sheriffs and constables to watch for a young woman matching Aileen's description. There was speculation that she might have planned her disappearance, perhaps having arranged to meet someone, though no one could imagine who that might be. All the eligible young men in the area were accounted for, and Aileen had shown no particular interest in any of them. Some whispered about the possibility of suicide, though the absence of a body argued against this. Others suggested she might have been taken by vagrants or criminals, though there had been no reports of strangers in the area. As the days turned into a week, the active search began to wind down. Men had crops to tend and livestock to care for, and while they remained willing to help, they could no longer devote entire days to combing the forest. The professional tracker brought in from Kentucky had followed her trail for several miles beyond where the shawl was found, but had lost it at a rocky stream crossing where she appeared to have walked in the water for some distance, either deliberately to throw off pursuit or simply following the easiest path. Deep in the forest, Aileen had lost all sense of time and direction. The days blended into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun through the canopy above. She had survived the first night by covering herself with leaves and pressing against a large rock that retained some of the day's warmth. Sleep had been impossible, with every sound making her heart race, imagining bears or wolves circling in the darkness. By the second day, terrible hunger had driven her to eat chestnuts and wild persimmons, though the latter were barely ripe, and left her mouth feeling as if she had eaten cotton. She had not intended to disappear. Not really. She had only wanted a few hours of solitude, a chance to clear her thoughts before the wedding that would change everything. But as she had walked deeper into the forest, something had shifted inside her. Each step away from Cedar Hollow had felt like shedding a heavy garment, until she felt lighter than she had in years. When she realized she was lost, the fear had been mixed with an unexpected exhilaration. For the first time in her life, her future was completely uncertain, completely her own. By the third day, the romantic notion of freedom had given way to the brutal reality of survival. Her dress, suitable for a morning walk, was torn and filthy. Her boots, made for garden paths and church floors, had begun to fall apart on the rocky terrain. She had found water easily enough. The mountains were full of streams, but food was scarce. The chestnuts helped, but she needed more substantial nutrition. She tried to remember the edible plants her grandmother had shown her, but in her hunger, everything began to look potentially edible and potentially poisonous. On the fourth night, she found shelter in a shallow cave, really more of an overhang of rock that showed signs of previous habitation. There were old ashes from a fire, and scratched into the rock were initials and dates, some going back decades. J.T., 1863. One read, perhaps a Confederate deserter hiding from the Home Guard. Another said, Mary C. went to God, 1871. And Aileen wondered if Mary had died here, or if someone had carved this memorial for a loved one lost in these woods. She managed to start a small fire using matches she had fortuitously carried in her pocket, having taken them that morning to light the kitchen stove. The fire was a comfort, but also a danger. She knew the smoke might be seen, might bring searchers, or worse, the kind of men who lived outside the law in these remote mountains. She had heard stories of moonshiners and outlaws who made their homes in the deep forest, men who would not welcome an intruder, especially a lone woman. But the cold was a more immediate threat than these hypothetical dangers, so she kept the fire small and hoped for the best. As she sat by her meager fire, Aileen thought about those she had left behind. She imagined her mother's tears, her father's rage, Margaret's confusion. She thought of Fergus, wondering if he was relieved or insulted by her disappearance. She felt guilt for the pain she was causing, but it was overshadowed by a fierce determination not to return to the life that had been planned for her. Better to die free in these woods, she thought, than to die slowly in a marriage that would suffocate her spirit. On the fifth day, she encountered another human being for the first time since entering the forest. It was an old woman, bent nearly double under a load of ginseng roots, moving through the trees with surprising agility. The woman showed no surprise at finding Aileen, as if encountering lost young women in the wilderness was a common occurrence. She spoke with an accent Aileen couldn't place, perhaps remnants of the Scots-Irish dialect preserved in these isolated mountains, mixed with something else, something older. The woman, who gave her name only as Granny Moss, shared her food, cornbread and dried venison, and didn't ask questions about why Aileen was alone in the forest. Instead, she talked about the mountains, as if they were living beings, with moods and memories. She pointed out edible plants Aileen had overlooked, showed her how to find grubs under rotting logs for protein, demonstrated how to weave a rough shelter from branches and leaves. When Aileen asked if she lived nearby, Granny Moss just laughed and said she lived wherever the roots grew best. Before parting, Granny Moss studied Aileen with eyes that seemed to see through to her soul. She said that the mountains had a way of keeping those who belonged to them and sending away those who didn't. She said Aileen had the look of someone the mountains might keep if she was strong enough to survive the choosing. Then she disappeared into the trees as quietly as she had appeared, leaving Aileen with a small pouch of dried meat and the unsettling feeling that the encounter might have been a dream. The skills Granny Moss had shared proved invaluable. Aileen found she could identify more edible plants, could build better shelters, could move more quietly through the forest. She began to follow game trails that led to water and forage, learning to read the signs animals left behind. She was still hungry, still cold at night, still frighteningly alone, but she was surviving. More than that, she was beginning to understand the rhythm of the forest, the patterns of light and shadow, the signals of approaching weather in the behavior of birds and insects. Meanwhile, in Cedar Hollow, the community had begun to accept that Aileen was gone, either dead or disappeared by choice. A memorial service was discussed, but Sarah Morrison refused to allow it, insisting her daughter was still alive. Fergus had quietly begun courting the Baxter widow, a practical woman with a proven ability to manage a household and raise children. The scandal of Aileen's disappearance would linger for years, becoming a cautionary tale mothers told their daughters about the dangers of too much education and too little submission to God's will. Thomas Morrison spent his evenings on the porch, staring at the forest's edge, a rifle across his knees. He told himself he was watching for his daughter's return, but in his heart he was guarding against the questions the forest raised. Had he driven her away with his strictness? Had his determination to see her properly married been a kind of violence worse than any physical blow? The forest gave no answers, only reflected his questions back in the whisper of wind through leaves. Margaret, alone among the family, believed Aileen had found what she was looking for. She had dreams sometimes where her sister appeared, wild-haired and free, wearing deerskin and walking barefoot through streams. In these dreams, Aileen never spoke, just smiled and disappeared into the green shadows. Margaret began to leave small offerings at the forest's edge, bits of bread and ribbon, as if her sister had become something that needed to be appeased rather than rescued. Autumn turned to winter in the mountains, and Aileen faced her greatest challenge yet. The leaves fell from the trees, eliminating much of her cover and making it harder to build warm shelters. The edible plants died back or became dormant, and the streams began to freeze at their edges. She had managed to trade some of her remaining possessions, her mother's silver hairpin and a small mirror, to a traveling tinker she encountered for a hunting knife and a worn blanket. The tinker had asked no questions about a young woman alone in the wilderness, perhaps recognizing her as one of the mountain's choosing, as Granny Moss had said. She learned to set snares for rabbits and squirrels, though her first attempts were failures that left her weeping with frustration and hunger. She discovered that survival required a hardness she hadn't known she possessed, the ability to kill and skin a creature that had been alive moments before, to eat things that would have disgusted her former self, to endure cold that felt like death creeping into her bones. The romantic notions of freedom had long since burned away, replaced by the simple, fierce desire to live another day. In December, she found the remains of an old cabin, abandoned decades ago, perhaps by Cherokee before the removal, or by early settlers who had given up the struggle against the mountains. The roof had partially collapsed, but one corner remained relatively intact, and she spent days reinforcing it with branches and mud, creating a shelter more substantial than anything she had managed before. She built a proper fireplace from stones, remembering her father's instructions to his sons about drawing smoke properly. The irony that his teachings were helping her survive her escape from his plans was not lost on her. Christmas came and went unmarked, except for her counting of days scratched on a stick. She had been in the forest for nearly 3 months, had survived what many said was impossible for a woman alone. Her hands, once soft and suitable for embroidery, were now calloused and scarred. Her hair, once her pride, was matted and short, having been roughly cut with her knife when it became too tangled to manage. She had lost weight, but gained strength, her body adapting to the constant work of survival. In January, during a particularly severe snowstorm, she heard voices outside her shelter. Her first instinct was to hide, but something in the tone, desperation mixed with exhaustion, made her peer through a crack in her makeshift wall. It was a young couple, barely more than children, the girl obviously pregnant, both near collapse from cold and hunger. Against every instinct for self-preservation, Aileen opened her door to them. They were runaways, the boy told her through chattering teeth, married in secret against their family's wishes. They had been trying to reach Kentucky, where the boy had cousins who might take them in, but had become lost in the storm. The girl, who gave her name as Lucy, was perhaps 17. Her pregnancy advanced enough that travel was dangerous, even in good weather. The boy, James, was maybe a year older, with the soft hands of someone who had never done hard labor. Aileen shared her meager supplies, knowing it might mean her own starvation, but unable to turn away someone in greater need. She helped deliver Lucy's baby 3 days later, drawing on memories of assisting the midwife in Cedar Hollow, though she had never been allowed to attend the actual births. It was a boy, small but healthy, his cries echoing through the frozen forest like a declaration of life's persistence. The presence of the young family changed everything for Aileen. She found herself hunting not just for her own survival, but for theirs, pushing herself to greater efforts, taking greater risks. She taught James what she had learned about the forest, watched him transform from a scared boy to a capable provider. She helped Lucy recover from childbirth with teas made from wild herbs, remedies her grandmother had known that seemed to rise from memory when needed. They stayed through the worst of winter, the 4 of them creating an odd family in the broken cabin. Aileen found herself telling them her story, or parts of it, explaining her presence in the wilderness without going into details about the life she had fled. They didn't judge her, perhaps understanding that the mountains were full of people running from something. The baby, whom they named William, became a source of joy that Aileen hadn't expected, his presence making their struggle feel purposeful rather than merely desperate. In March, as spring began to touch the mountains with green, a group of hunters stumbled upon the cabin. Aileen heard them coming and had time to hide, watching from the forest as they approached. She recognized one of them, her cousin Daniel from Cedar Hollow, though he looked older, worn by the winter. She could hear them talking to James, could hear her own name mentioned. They were still searching for her, or at least asking about her, even after all these months. James, bless him, claimed ignorance, saying he and his wife had found the cabin abandoned and had sheltered there for the winter. The hunters were suspicious, but had no reason to disbelieve him. They shared news from the outside world, including that the Morrison family was well, though forever changed by their daughter's disappearance. Her father had aged greatly, they said, and rarely spoke. Her mother continued to insist Aileen was alive. Margaret had become engaged to a shopkeeper from the county seat, a match she had chosen herself, her parents too broken to object. After the hunters left, Aileen made a decision. She gave James and Lucy directions to a settlement she had learned about from the tinker, a place where questions weren't asked and hard work was valued more than proper marriage papers. She gave them the few valuable things she had left, including her mother's wedding ring, which she had worn on a cord around her neck. They protested, but she insisted, saying she had learned to live without such things. Before they parted, Lucy embraced her and whispered that she thought Aileen was the bravest woman she had ever known. Aileen wanted to tell her that it wasn't bravery, but desperation that had driven her into the forest, that courage and fear were so intertwined she couldn't separate them anymore. Instead, she kissed baby William's forehead and watched the little family disappear down the mountain path toward their new life. Alone again, Aileen stood at a crossroads. She could follow them to the settlement, try to build a new life among strangers. She could attempt to return to Cedar Hollow, though she knew that life was closed to her now, even if she wanted it. Or she could remain in the mountains, continuing the existence she had carved out through suffering and determination. Spring was coming, bringing easier living, abundant food, warmth. She had survived the worst the mountains could offer. As she stood there, she heard movement in the forest, and turned to see Granny Moss emerging from the trees, looking exactly as she had months ago, as if winter had not touched her. The old woman studied Aileen's face, now tanned and weathered, her body now lean and strong, her eyes now holding knowledge that comfort could never teach. Granny Moss nodded, as if Aileen had passed some test, and gestured for her to follow. They walked deeper into the forest than Aileen had ever been, to a valley she hadn't known existed, where a small community of people lived in rough cabins and tended gardens carved from the wilderness. They were people like her, Granny Moss explained, people the mountains had chosen, who had found freedom in the wild places. Some had been runaway slaves, some Confederate deserters, some Cherokee who had hidden rather than walk the Trail of Tears, some simply people who didn't fit in the world below. They welcomed Aileen without questions, recognizing her as one of their own by the way she moved through the forest, by the look in her eyes that spoke of hard choices and harder living. She learned that Granny Moss was their healer and keeper of stories, that she walked between their hidden community and the outside world, trading herbs and roots for supplies they couldn't produce themselves. Months later, Aileen stood again at the edge of the forest, but this time looking out at Cedar Hollow from above, hidden in the trees. She could see her family's farm, could see the smoke rising from the chimney of what had been her home. She had come to leave a sign that she was alive, a small carved wooden bird that Margaret would recognize, placed where her sister would find it on one of her walks. She watched Margaret discover it, saw her clutch it to her chest, and look toward the forest, with tears streaming down her face. For a moment, Aileen almost stepped out, almost returned to embrace her sister, to ease her family's pain. But then she heard the sound of children playing in her hidden valley, thought of the vegetables growing in her own garden, the cabin she had built with her own hands, the life she had chosen rather than accepted. She turned back to the forest, walking into its green embrace, knowing she had become what her mother would never understand, a woman who belonged to no one but herself and the mountains that had made her. The story of the girl who walked into the woods and never returned became a legend in Cedar Hollow, told and retold until the truth was indistinguishable from fiction. Some said she had died that first winter, her bones scattered by animals. Some said she had been murdered by vagrants or moonshiners. A few, mostly young women who felt the walls of their lives closing in, whispered that she had found what she was looking for, that on certain mornings, if you looked carefully at the forest's edge, you could see a figure watching from the trees, wild and free as the wind itself.